Right, today on the show we have Loh Lik Peng. He's the founder and director of Unlisted Collection, which owns several hotels and restaurants in Singapore, London, Shanghai, and Sydney, with the recently opened the Eau Claire Hotel. He also chairs the Shatek Institute and hosts directorship at the Asian Civilization Museum and the Peranakan Museum. All right, so thank you for coming.
Thank you.
When someone asks you, what do? How do you answer that these days?
So it's a strange one. I still have a hard time really giving a description. I used to have a really hard time saying I was a hotelier because I always felt like a little bit of a fraud. But nowadays I say hotelier. Yeah.
With conviction.
With a bit more conviction. I used to think it was a little bit fraudulent to call myself hotelier because I didn't really learn how to be a hotelier. And neither did I really run the hotel. So, I couldn't really tell you how a hotel was run. I set up some hotels, but really more from the perspective of the development. But yeah, nowadays I say hotelier with a bit more conviction.
And how would you define the term hotelier then?
I guess someone who kind of...
or if there's a better term to describe yourself.
Yeah, I guess for me, I struggle with it, because I don't really operate the hotels. I operate the hotels from a sense of the ownership maybe, but not necessarily from the day-to-day running of it. But I guess that is part of being a hotelier. And I also, I guess, do all the conception stuff at the beginning, But I don't really run the hotels. After they open, really I get the GMs to run them. And perhaps I look at the numbers once a month or a couple of times a month maybe. So from that perspective, yeah, I still struggle a little bit about defining my role.
All right, so let's go back to where you first start growing up, in Dublin, Ireland, right?
Mm-hmm.
With your doctor parents, how was it like growing up? Were you living in the city center or town? And how do your parents even end up being there?
My parents were studying and working in Ireland at the time. My dad was there for his school, boarding school, and then after that he was there for university. So he spent a substantial amount of time there. My parents met there, they got married. I was born there. They came back soon after to Singapore though. So I would have spent the early part of my childhood in Singapore before they sent me back to boarding school in Ireland. So I guess the early part of my childhood was very, very much a Singaporean experience.
And how old were you there then from boarding school till?
I was there from age 12 to 18.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so pretty much straight after PSLE.
How do you enjoy your boarding school experience?
I actually loved it. It was one of the, looking back, one of the best periods of my life. It was one of those times when, in retrospect, yeah, it was a very valuable experience for me. When I first went, I didn't like it very much. I obviously was very homesick, and it was a strange environment. I felt a little bit sort of, I guess, coming from Singapore, a tropical country, you end up in somewhere like Ireland, it rains all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was somewhat of a strange experience for me at the start, but I made a lot of friends there, and yeah, looking back, it was one of the best periods of my life.
And you just sort of went alone, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, my sister was also sent,
Oh.
but she was in a different school from me.
Okay.
Yeah. So boarding school in those days, you didn't really get to go out. So I hardly saw her maybe once every 2 months or so. This is way before, advent of handphones. So you couldn't even call home. You had to
No
wait
way.
by a payphone. I remember at a specific time, and the parents would call in. Yeah, it was just different. So maybe you'd speak to the parents once a month,
Oh wow.
And we'd fly back maybe at Christmas, Easter. That was about it. Summer holidays.
Chinese New Year?
No,
But school started.
No. Chinese New Year, we were always in school.
Oh wow.
So for a long period of time, I didn't really have any Chinese New Years at all. So to be honest, even to this day, I don't really put too much store by Chinese New Year because it was never that big a part of my kind of childhood. So I don't really get Chinese New Year too much. It doesn't bother me if I miss it.
And how would you describe yourself then, when you are a young boy?
I
Looking
would have
back.
described myself as a very
Yeah.
naughty kid.
Is it?
Part of the reason why my parents decided to send me to boarding school, I suspect. Yeah, I was naughty. I guess I got pulled up a lot in school. I remember getting caned quite a few times.
By the school or by parents?
Oh yeah, by the principals.
Okay.
Yeah, in the school.
Back then,
In
caning was
Singapore
allowed.
and even in Dublin. Yeah, corporal punishment was a thing in those days.
Yeah.
So if I had to describe myself, yeah, in my childhood, I would naughty would be the one word that immediately came to mind.
And was that the reason why then parents sent you to boarding school, or do they actually already wanted you?
I think certainly the fact that I was naughty and not doing as well in school system in Singapore was a factor. My Mandarin was very, very poor. Needless to say, in those days that was a big minus factor, So I think that drove the decision as much as anything else. And there was obviously some sentiment to it because my father came from the same school. So I guess there was that element of that, but I think a large part of it was the fact that I was a pretty naughty kid, I think.
And your sister will also send together with you for the same reasons?
Not really for the same reasons. I think
Or
she
because you
wanted
were
to
going,
go.
or she wanted
She
to?
wanted to go, so she got sent to a girls' boarding school in Dublin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Together, same
Together
time?
at the same time.
Yeah. Were you then, I mean, there was an argument that you spoke with your wife Min, right? About sending the
Yes.
current.
She's not gonna. I'm not gonna win that argument. But yeah, we've had a debate about it. Yeah, not really serious arguments. Obviously, my kid's only 5 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, why did you want then to? Because your kids haven't went to school yet, so we don't know if maybe he's naughty or he's not.
I think for me, very much it is a sentiment thing now, more than anything else, because he would be the third generation to go to that school.
Right.
And I enjoyed myself so much there, that I thought he would too. It's no more than that. I'm sure the education here would be equally fulfilling for him, and so if I did send him, it'd be more to fulfill that, sentiment for me more than anything else.
And you took law. Was that your choice or your parents or both? Looking back.
Yeah, you know what? It was a default choice. It was my choice, but it was more of a default thing because in those days I come from a family where both parents are doctors. Growing up, there was always an assumption I should be a doctor. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor. Default choice was to be a lawyer, I guess. So I studied law. My parents weren't going to let me do something like history or geography for sure. So, I studied law for that reason, but I never had a great passion for it, really. It was more of a default.
And what did you specialize in? Any part of the law, and the whole spectrum of the law when you were there?
I was a litigator and mostly doing commercial work. So it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to specialize in it. That was just the kind of thing that was going at the time. I entered practice in the late 90s. The bulk of the work we were doing as litigators then was bankruptcy, and litigation to do with bankruptcy and winding ups and stuff like that. It was the tail end of the last Asian crisis. So that was just the nature of the work that was called for at that time.
Are there any lessons or knowledge you took from law they bring to unlisted or in life in general?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. Those type of skills they're never in you hope they're not in high demand, certainly, but they're never absent from your day-to-day work and your day-to-day life, in fact. So every day, as a business, we deal with complex commercial things, and involved in that, there are definitely legal things that you have to think about. So that stands me in good stead, I would say.
Yeah. No, I asked that question because Charlie Munger, who is Bill Gates' other half, was also law background, and he said that he doesn't want to be in law and tell people not to be in law, but having the foundation of law does help him make very clear decisions.
Yeah.
Would that be something?
Yeah, law, I would say, is a good discipline insofar as it makes you think about the pitfalls of anything you get into, because that's the raison d'etre of a lawyer, right? He's there to get you out of a pickle, and he's there to structure agreements so that you have the best protection should something go wrong. So that part of your training never quite goes away. You can't let it dominate your kind of commercial business life, because lawyers are by nature and by training very risk adverse. That's what they do. And the things we do, you can't be too risk adverse. So there's always a balance that you need to draw.
How do you do that?
I try not to think too much about the law and all the things that can go wrong, because if you did, you'd just be consumed by it and you'd end up doing nothing.
As a director of Unlisted, what do you spend most of your time and energy on these days?
I would say at the moment, nothing, when we have projects ongoing, you're really consumed by that project for the duration of the project. So we just opened a hotel called the Old Clare in Sydney. The Old Clare Hotel in Sydney, this New Majestic. Yes. Freudian slip. The Old Clare Hotel in Sydney, and that probably consumed my life for the 2 years that it was going on for, right? Because that's the only thing you think about. You're thinking of the project, almost 24/7. You're flying to Sydney all the time, things like that. So at the moment, I don't have any projects ongoing anywhere near that level of intensity. So I'm feeling pretty relaxed, in fact.
And which is why we managed to get to see here today. And what were your initial goals for 1929 when you actually got it?
Well,
and if there's any also bottom line?
Well, to be completely frank with you, at that time I didn't have any goals. I had no idea what was going to result from that. And I just wanted to open that little hotel and go back to practice, actually. I took a year sabbatical from law, thinking I would go back to practice. Open 1929, go back to practice. I never did, obviously, because 1929 was a lot more successful than I thought it would be. But at that time, I was just opening this small hotel in Chinatown without any idea what I was doing. I didn't have, any idea where you would go. All I knew was that it would be quite a lot of fun while it lasted. And it was. But I had no idea whether it would succeed. And frankly, I was quite surprised when it did succeed.
What was the story there with 1929? Because we know that you found that property on a cheap end of the deal. You got it. But from there, as a lawyer, to become a hotelier is a big difference. Do you have any help? Was there, what were your first to go? And
I never thought about it that way. Honestly, I never thought about it that way at the time. I took a year off from legal practice. I thought I was going to go back to legal practice. I opened the hotel thinking that it would just be a sideline thing. It would be fun, and that would be the end of it.
So you took a year off first, and then the hotel came about, or you knew the hotel?
No. I purchased the hotel, and I knew I had to take a year off, otherwise it'd never get built. And so that was supposed to be my year off doing that hotel. But it dragged on, and I never went back to practice. After a while, it just became, impossible for me to go back to practice. I opened this hotel, New Majestic, and then it kind of snowballed from there. And before I knew it, I more or less became a hotelier. People said I was a hotelier. Before that, I identified myself maybe more as a lawyer. I'd still introduced myself as a lawyer. In fact, I kept my license for quite a number of years after I effectively quit law, because somehow I thought I might go back to practice. I never did, but
Did you work with then a specific architect for 1929? Because you have visions when you walk into an old building. And so with that, you must have a specific architect or,
No, when I first look at a building, it's usually a very clean slate. I wouldn't have thought of which architect to work with. I wouldn't even necessarily have thought of what to do with it. So a lot of the projects, when you first look at it, you are drawing a picture in your mind. The end result may be completely different from that picture, but often you don't really know where you're going to go with it. You don't know what restaurants you're going to put there, what design, things like that. So in none of the hotels have I ever kind of come with it with a very strong view and had already an architect in mind, things like that. It always really depended on the project that turned up, and what might then kind of come of it, whether it was, a hotel or service department or restaurant. Yeah, but at the time when you first look at a project, you don't always have a very strong idea of what's going to come of it, even if you fall in love with the building.
Yeah, but then what would be the core team that you first formed when building a new establishment, a hotel specifically?
I would say the first person you do appoint is probably an architect. Not always, but often, yeah. I think the key person, but sometimes it's not that easy to kind of think of the architectural thing. So maybe you don't, you just get a planning specialist to look at it, whether or not you can turn it into a hotel or
Like a
whatever.
structural engineer?
Yeah, those kind of things, you do your investigations. More to find out from the local councils what the planning parameters might be. So you don't always hire an architect that you want to work with first. But in terms of conceptualizing and designing a hotel, that's usually always the first person you go to.
And then subsequently, after the architect, what were people we were looking at? Not that I'm going to open a hotel.
Well, no, all the rest of by now, I guess I have it down, pretty pat. I know who I need to go to. It's usually the structural engineers, mechanical, electrical engineers, all those type of different professions that you need to design the hotel. But in the early days, I grappled with that a lot. I didn't really know, and you'd kind of get advice from different people, often wrong. But the early first hotel, 1929, and even this one, to some extent, it was very much groping in the dark. You were just winging it, more or less.
You didn't seek any specific help from
Not
specialists
really.
or?
Not really, which is, thinking back, pretty brave actually. A lot could have gone wrong, but I was very lucky that, things didn't go that wrong. But that's pure luck, not by design for sure.
Why did you choose to sell back 1929 on leaseback agreement, right?
Yeah, I sold and leased it back. I guess it was just an opportunity, really, to
What were you considering? What was the opportunity that you were looking at?
I was just considering recycling the capital and doing something else with it. But it was a very tough decision. I grappled with it for a long time because 1929 was my first hotel, and for sentimental reasons, the one that I was most attached to. For that reason,
That was not for New Majestic, is it?
Huh?
No, the capital that you got.
No, it wasn't. I only sold it a couple of years ago, and New Majestic we opened in 2006.
Yeah.
So it was many, many years after that. I think it was just more a question of using the capital to do other things, because Singapore, you can only really kind of do so much in Singapore before you kind of bump up against yourself, more or less, in neighborhoods that you're in. So we were looking to do stuff overseas, and liquidating some assets just made sense for us in realizing the capital gains that we had in order to do other projects. Otherwise, it'd been much riskier and much more difficult.
Which was your first overseas establishment?
Overseas, the first one was Waterhouse, I think, in Shanghai.
Why that?
Why?
What's the story, actually?
Actually, Shanghai, Waterhouse was just a friend introducing me. He knew I'd done the 2 hotels here. Then I think in Shanghai, he was looking for retail spaces. This is when was this? 07, 08 or something? I think it was 08. And he was looking to open retail premises there. He came across this site that was not good for retail, but he thought it would be perfect for a boutique hotel. So he called me up. I went up to look with them, and I thought it was perfect for a hotel, and that's really how the Waterhouse came about. But at the time, the area was still pretty rough. It was the old docks of Shanghai, so it was a lot of old buildings, but beautiful old buildings. Buildings from the 20s, the 1910s, 1920s. Some simple Art Deco buildings, not as ornate, certainly as the main bund. But that was where the industrial kind of zones were. That was the original docks of Shanghai. So right by the river and beautiful. And that's really how Waterhouse came about. So all my overseas ventures have also been largely opportunistic and to some extent accidental. People introduce them to you. I never went out looking for them.
Oh.
But people introduced them to you, and you looked at it, and I looked at it and said, wow, okay, we could do something with this. And really, that's how they came about.
Every time you see a property, because I assume that boutique hotel it's not the run-of-mill revenue churning hotel as what you see with the big chains. Do you see it more as a property investment, or actually just by operation of hotel?
You have to
As a
look at
business
it,
point of view.
You have to look at it as both, really. You can't. It's inescapable that hotels are real estate assets and they are very capital intensive. But at the same time, when you run a hotel, it's very operational. It's day to day. It's 24/7. So both aspects are very important for different reasons. But inevitably, you always realize at the end of the day that this is a real estate asset. We can't get away from it.
Okay, let's move on to F&B. Most of the restaurant establishments are open with a chef being the co-owner. Has that always been from the start, and why?
So yes, it has always been from the start. We've always had equity partnerships with our key chefs, and that started with my very first restaurant. Ember, that's right, with Sebastian Ng at the time. And the reason for that is I always recognize that the really talented chefs, you can't keep them with you if you don't give them some skin in the game. At the end of the day, everyone has to look after their own careers, their own families. They have an obligation to themselves to do the best that they can, and so you must try and align their interests as much with yours as you can. And the way to do that for me is to give them equity in the business. And then you don't have to motivate them. They're self-motivated. They are going out to do the best that they can in the best interest of the business. I'm not particularly sort of concerned about, controlling every aspect of the business. In fact, I try not to do anything with the restaurants on a day-to-day basis if I can help it. I want the chefs to be self-motivated and to do the best they can for the business, and I try not to interfere with that.
Where do you get that from the idealization of the arrangement, or has that always, you have been tinkering with that idea and you sort of decided that that is the way to go for it?
It wasn't so much tinkering or not tinkering. It was just result of having conversations with like people like Sebastian when I first met him. And I wanted to give him a good deal. I wanted him to come in because it was in his best interest, not because I was setting up a restaurant. I needed a chef. When you speak to a lot of chefs, they have a very clear idea in their mind what they want to do with their restaurants and things like that. It's about finding the right fit with that person and giving him the tools to do the best job he can.
What was the story with Sebastian?
Someone introduced him to me, and at the time he was cooking for the Marmalade Group, but he wasn't happy. He wanted to leave, so a friend of mine said, "Hey, there's this interesting chef. Knowing that I was opening this hotel, why don't you speak with him?" I spoke with him. We talked about, and we had very good chemistry. We got on very well. That's how it happened. Literally, more or less on a handshake, I guess. So a lot of our restaurant ventures since have really been the result of sort of just having really good chemistry with the chefs, and getting on well with them and being on the same wavelength. And it's worked out quite well for us.
What did Sebastian have any traits that stands out? I mean, for you?
Tricks?
Yeah, personality, or
I don't know.
Was it the resume?
It wasn't so much that, Here was this humble person who was cooking an amazing, cooking these amazing meals, and a humble background. His English wasn't great, It's not the sort of person you would expect it to be kind of cooking this kind of food. It's the same with Justin Quek in a way. Producing exquisite food, but you speak to him, he's quite a humble fellow. They don't necessarily come from the sort of milieu where when they were young they were eating very fine dining food. The profile of chefs that you find nowadays has changed dramatically. A lot of them do come from those backgrounds, but the early generation of chefs who were really successful, like Justin Quek and all this, didn't come from those backgrounds, and yet they were producing this amazing kind of French food and European style food, And Sebastian was a bit in that mold, I guess. And he was very driven. He was very motivated. He was just great to work with. I never had to chase him one day in my life. He worked harder than anyone I knew up to that point.
No way. That was great. And continuing, you became investing in more restaurants, moving away from hotel. Is there a reason why?
Simple, I guess, for us is because for one thing, we first started our restaurants as part of hotels, and they were integral part of the hotels. But the restaurants we were doing at our hotels became so successful in their own right that it made sense for us to expand. So that was the first impetus. The second was that it's much easier to do a restaurant than a hotel. A restaurant you can open in 6 months. Hotels take years. There are no shortcuts. If you're developing a hotel from scratch, it's at least 2 years. And often much longer. By the time you get your planning permission and doing the design, tender, then you're contracting and all that, it can take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So you can't do that many hotels at the same time because they're very capital intensive and they are just very time consuming. Whereas a restaurant, you can open 5 restaurants in a year, no problem. And so it just became easier to open restaurants.
And for your restaurant, do you own the property?
Not always.
Okay, sometimes on a lease.
Sometimes, yes.
Okay, so
Quite
then
often on leases, yeah.
Yeah, no, because I asked that in the sense that restaurant, like hotel too, is not the most lucrative business from a business standpoint.
No, it's not.
Yeah, so which is my reason to ask that question.
Well, it's also restaurants are much less capital intensive than a hotel, right? Hotel, you're literally spending tens of millions. A restaurant, you can do it for a tiny fraction of that. So from a risk point of view, it's always easier to do a restaurant than a hotel. And your leases are much shorter and all those kind of things, right? It just performs on a different scale from a hotel. And hotels can be very profitable if you get the right model, operating side. But of course, the real estate is the largest component of the business. It always is in a hotel.
Yeah, and when you look at restaurant, if it's on the list, do you speculate based on what kind of timeline do you speculate? Is it 2 years, 5 years?
It depends. You try and make your money back within 2 years for sure. Some restaurants don't. Some restaurants make it back in 6 months. It just depends on type of concept. But for a scenario planning point of view, you always look at it within the 2-3 year horizon. Otherwise, it doesn't make as much sense.
Looking at personalities and traits, right? When the co-owner of a restaurant, what are some things that you look for? Knowing what you know now.
How do you mean?
Is it personalities or traits?
You're talking about the chef?
The chef.
You work with?
The co-owner of the restaurant is the chef,
okay.
correct? Usually it's the head chef.
It's always the chef.
It's always the chef.
I guess for me, it's fairly intangible. It's really about getting on well with the person, having good rapport, good chemistry, and a good level of trust. So it's not a specific thing you look for. It's more an intangible thing. Whether or not you think this person, you can get along with him in the long term, because it's more or less like a marriage. When you do a restaurant at someone, it's a long term thing.
Yeah, that's why I asked, because since if it's a marriage and I'm a wedding planner, doesn't this handshaking activity requires more than a meal together? Or
It does. That's why it takes a while. I mean, but for me, I don't have a particular formula that I look for in a person. A lot of it is really down to a gut feel about that person's character, and whether or not you have good chemistry with them. And by that, I don't mean, you have a good laugh together, but I mean, do you have a good sense of where his business values lies, whether they align with yours, whether it's the kind of restaurant and concept that you like. Because I get approached all the time with concepts, and sometimes they just don't gel with you. So there are quite a few factors that you look for before you agree to sign up with someone, I guess. But it's not always something readily identifiable that you can sketch on a sheet of paper or something.
So let's say if someone were to pitch you a restaurant, what are the few things they would need to bring to you other than an idea in their head?
A very, very good sense of the concept. Some outline numbers so that they are aware of what their costs are going to be, what their projected revenue should be, where they need to sit on the rent, all these kind of things. So, and these are things we can help them with. But if I'm speaking to someone who's pitching to me about a restaurant, those are the kind of things I want to hear about, that they've thought of it, and not just looking at cooking or opening a restaurant as some kind of artistic endeavor. Some people think that, and that's usually the wrong person to work with, because you'll have a nightmare trying to get him into line when the business suffers or it doesn't do well.
Yeah, because I'm saying this also in the future, you might be approached again and they were like, okay, just listen to this podcast first and then prepare all the things that I say and then come to me again.
We don't ask for huge reams of data, but they've got to know very well the concept that they want. They have to know it inside out. They've got to be capable of it, of pulling it off, and they've got to have a rough idea of what numbers they need to hit in order to survive.
Because you seem to me like such a calm, relaxed, hang back person. And I couldn't imagine you just like, I need this, and this. It's also, I feel it's more also like the person who comes pitch to you, they should just be prepared.
Yeah, I mean, some of them we don't ask for all these things for, because I know them well enough. Like Dave at Burn Ends came from London, where he worked for us in London. It's the same with Clayton Wells at Autonomy. Clayton worked for us for many years in London. So these guys, do I really sit down with them and make them produce all these things? No, because I know them well enough already. But if it's someone I don't know well, then yes, obviously we make sure that they are well aware of what their business needs to be at before they can succeed.
I have heard from your employees that you remember almost everyone's name.
Really?
They were very surprised. Is there any secret technique?
No. I just try and get to know everyone. Everyone is you respect everyone. You give them that due respect. So you have to know who they are. So you just have to make the effort. I don't particularly have any technique for it. I just feel it's good.
Yeah. I feel it too. Yeah, but they were asking this from them actually. They were like surprised. Like, how does he remember my name?
Yeah. No, I make a effort to, every member of staff is valuable. So you treat them like humans. You got to try and know who they are, not just their names, their backgrounds, families, things like that, as much as you can, without being intrusive. You want a creepy boss.
Yeah. How do you give people autonomy in their jobs while making sure that they are doing a good job?
That's a tough one, It took me a long time to kind of get that right. And I think it's really about just exposing people to different parts of the job and watching how they do it, and eventually giving them the whole thing to do. Because there are not enough hours in the days. You can't do it all yourself. And frankly, if you were standing over someone's shoulder looking at their work all the time, you wouldn't get anyone good working for you. So it's a question of building trust with that person and letting them get on with it. So I'm a big believer in that, giving people autonomy in their jobs. Someone joins you, let him spend a month looking at his environment, figuring out what he needs to do, his role in it. Give him responsibilities, and then load him with more responsibilities, and then pretty soon let him run the part of his business that he's in charge of. And you try not to micromanage people. Let them do it. And usually by that time they know what they need to do. They have their own spin on it, which I always encourage, because there's more than one way to skin a cat. And usually the results are good.
And with that said, what are some of the more important metrics or indicators that you look at?
For someone I'm going to hire?
Yeah.
I would say...
And even those that you have already hired, but like, the first...
Okay. First of all, I think I'm always looking for people, that means that they are generally fairly sociable. Because, the business we're in, you can't be a shy, retiring person and not want to mix with people and not want to socialize. I think the people who do best in this sort of business are people. They like to hang around other people. They like to energize the room. So as much as possible, we try and hire people like that. The other thing I look for is just people who have a good amount of sort of common sense rather than, because you'd be surprised. And by that I mean people who can just get on with things and without, if you can hire an idiot and direct him what to do every second of the day, that would probably work out if you could afford to direct him every second of the day, But usually you can't. So you try and hire people with common sense who will get on with the job without having to be, micromanaged and directed in every second of the day, and that's something we try and look for as much as possible in the people we hire, because it just makes your life a lot easier if you can find people who are able to get on with it. I always say to my guys, get on with it. Don't wait for me to give you directions about what to do and how to do it.
And with that said, you are also in Singapore. In Singapore, everyone in F&B, in the hotel, is facing a labor problem. How do you then, get the cream of the crop, if that is said?
Well, you don't always get cream of the crop, and you don't need to. I think you need to get people who are self-respecting and have pride in their work. Do we always look for some kind of crazy star performer and someone who's got covered all the bases in his career? Not really. I think we don't always need those. In some parts of the business, maybe you do. But honestly, we just look for people who are self-motivated, who are excited to do their jobs. They don't all need to be superstar, the best people. But you hear that all the time from, management gurus, how to hire the best and all that. It's not always easy. And I don't try and hire the best all the time for every single job. I try and find people at the right stage of their careers who are enthusiastic about doing certain things and certain functions. And in a few years' time, sometimes they leave you and find other jobs to grow in their careers. That's okay. But I don't need to find a fully formed super employee for every position.
Yeah. And with that said, do you engineer their jobs in such a way that, with people now leaving every 2 years, or maybe even lesser, how do you if there is anything, they put some thoughts into it?
Well, I think you have to treat people with respect, as I said, and if you do that, and if you give them a fulfilling job, and you pay them well, I think most people will stay with you for at least a decent amount of time until it's time for them to move on for career reasons. And I think we do our fair share in that regard, and we get our fair share of employees who are loyal and stay on longer than market expectations, I guess.
Yeah, I was just at a wedding last weekend at Poland.
In Poland?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a wedding. Yeah, I'm wedding. No, not my wedding. Yeah, I'm a wedding planner by day.
Yeah. But you said in Poland.
In Poland.
Okay.
No, the Flower Dome.
Oh, Poland. I thought you meant sorry. Poland as in the country.
No, Poland.
Oh, you just in. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No, I think your maybe your parents came by.
That's right, they did.
Yeah.
Yes, I know there was a wedding on at the weekend.
Yes, because the GM was there as well.
On Saturday, right?
Yes.
Yes. Stepan was there.
Yeah.
Oh, that was the wedding you were organizing.
Yeah.
I saw the pictures online.
Oh, that was fast.
Yeah. Well, I knew it was on, so I checked the Instagram account.
Yeah. How about let's look at failures. How do you view failures?
Well, they're almost inevitable, I guess. I'm long in the tooth enough to know that not everything you do is going to succeed, and I accept that sometimes things I do will fail. That's part of life. Yeah.
At which point did you know to cut your losses? The first one must be the hardest.
Yes, yes, but you always know when to cut the losses. It's usually shouting you in the face, Yeah, it's usually pretty obvious.
Because with the whole entrepreneur and startup culture, it's always tweak, 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 tweak,
Yeah.
tweak until you win, right?
Yeah.
And you know, what's then, you know, is it to cut or to tweak?
I think sometimes it's a question of how much energy you're willing to invest in something. Because tweaking something doesn't mean it'll succeed. Sometimes it does. You got to recognize those moments, I guess, and they're not always teachable moments, because I think the circumstances change a lot, and what might work in one situation might not work in another. So, you know, to tweak or not to tweak, I think sometimes it's just a judgment call. You know, there's no formula for it. But some things, you know, whether it's sometimes you know the location is just not good. So would tweaking it help? Maybe not. So I think you just have to realize sometimes that, you know, something is not going to work, I guess, and shut it down. But by then you usually know. You know.
Unlisted. In 2011, why did Unlisted happen? Was it a HQ for marketing and HR? Because all these are all individually run business, right? What was the thought then?
Well, by then we had been running for a number of years. We had quite a lot of different concepts overseas as well as in Singapore. And although we always tried to cross-market to some extent, we weren't particularly good at it because we didn't have a vehicle for it, you know. And so Unlisted Collection came about because of that. We were just looking to have an umbrella for a range of brands that really didn't have a lot in common with each other otherwise. Yeah, and so Unlisted came about because of that. It was just more a necessity, and we did it for that reason. And this worked out quite well for us because, you know, from there we understood a little bit more about what our different brands were and how they needed to operate parallel to each other rather than, because they're all distinct concepts and we have kept them as distinct concepts. But, you know, at the same time, how do you make the obvious connections?
So will you say it's mainly for marketing purposes?
Yes. It is mainly for marketing purposes, even to this day. How do you cross-market? How do you find obvious ways of working with each other?
Why? Okay, this is funny. Because you have a whole list of places where you chair.
Okay.
And I was just like, how do you find? Because I have a friend, Beyond Ching, who runs Artichoke, who also teaches and, you know, do events, and you know, great guy.
Yep.
And what you do even more, chairs at even more places than him. Obviously, like why? And then let's go on to the, you know, what do you need to do in each.
Sometimes it's interest, sometimes it's feeling about giving back to the industry. So, for example, I chair ShaTech. And that's very much feeling of obligation to give back to the industry. And it's such an important role, you know, to bring new people into the industry. And I feel that, you know, if I'm asked to do it, I should step up and try and give my best where I can. So, and I guess it was one of those roles that was, in a way, thrust upon me. I was asked whether I would be, you know, and I said, okay, I'll give it, I'll do my best. And it's a rewarding role. You have a lot of fun doing it, you know, because you see the pupils coming through. You try and make sure that you're well connected with industry and that you are churning out students who are relevant to the industry. And it gives you a great insight to what industry is doing and the kind of talent throughput that's coming out. You know, and as for the other things that I work on, you know, some of them are charitable ones, like, you know, National Volunteer and Philanthropy Council. Again, those things are about giving back to society and seeing if there are things you do in your professional life, in your personal life that can contribute to wider society. And you know, it's something my parents taught me, I guess, you know, how you should always try and look after those less fortunate than you, if in your capacity you are able to do so. So as much as I can, I try and do that. It's not always easy. I think partly because of competing interests and time and all these kind of things. But if someone asks you to and you can do it, you should definitely do it. So that's always been my philosophy. And as for things like NHB stuff, whether it's the museums and all that, it's stuff I've always really enjoyed. So for me, I get a lot of personal reward out of it. I've always been very much into heritage and conservation and things like that. So
Do you get to choose like what to keep and what to put on?
No, not really, but we work with the museum curators and things like that. It's always a huge collaborative. I mean, the thing about museums is they are large organizations. They got enormous budgets. They are, tied to many sort of national agendas and things like that. So, in a sense, it's a large, like a large cruise liner. You direct things in a certain way, things like that. But it's always with a mind to your capabilities within the museum, what the mission of the museum is, things like that. It's not a large ego trip where you're trying to figure out, wow, what do I want to show? Those things almost never happen.
So, I mean, like hearing from what you say, it's kind of like going in, knowing what they do, understanding that,
Yep.
and then delivering it.
Yeah, you have to be there to serve the institution, not yourself, and the role of all the museums is slightly different, whether you're a national museum or you're the Asian Civilizations Museum or you're the National Gallery. All of them have a different raison d'etre, and you have to figure out how best you can serve the interests of that institution.
And with Shatec per se, what were your few decision points? What were things that are pushing with the school?
Well, it's always about making sure that you're producing the best talent for the industry that you can, and making your courses relevant and making sure that your institution itself remains relevant to the industry. Because at the end of the day, that's what a school like Shatec is there for. It's there to produce talent, a pipeline of talent for the industry. So you got to keep reminding yourself that that's what you're there for.
And with that in mind, how then the time, that's the crux of it, right?
You have to juggle. But time management is just one of those things. You've got to find enough hours in the day and make sure that you are doing the things that really engage you. And if you do things that really engage you and that matter to you, the time isn't such a huge commitment. You learn to live with, rushing to certain things or having to have less time to yourself. So, but if you're doing something that's a chore, then that becomes a big issue. Even if you have to spend a little time on it, it's a big problem. But the things that engage you, the things you find interesting, the things that you find valuable, you usually find the time for it, within reason,
And with that said, what activities engages you and inspire you lately?
I would say a lot of it is still to do with work, What really gets me going in the morning is finding that project to do, that old building that you want to restore and the new hotel you want to create. And it's not, these projects don't come around every day. At the moment I don't have one, for example. But you yearn for the day when you find that special project you want to take on again. And each time I've done it, whether it's the Eau Claire, Town Hall Hotel, Waterhouse, it's always been just an amazing experience while it lasts. And then it gets finished and you have to move on to the next one.
Yeah. So this question, another one from an ex-employee, how many Barber chairs have you collected?
I think I have more than a dozen. No, I have easily more than a dozen. I stopped counting, in fact, but I have a lot.
Are they all around?
I have, yeah, but all our properties have one.
Why Barber chairs?
I don't know, it's a nostalgia thing for me again. I remember as a child, my dad used to bring us to, bring me specifically, to get haircuts on the weekends. And there were always these old cast iron barber chairs, I remember them from my childhood. And for a while, they started disappearing. All the barbers were switching to modern chairs. And I realized that all these amazing barber chairs, big cast iron things, were for sale at really not expensive prices. So I started buying them, and I realized that they were just such great pieces of furniture. A lot of people connected it. They saw this old barber chair and it brought back memories of their childhood. I still remember sitting on those. And in fact, I remember I used to have a little wooden block from when I was very small. They put the wooden block on the chair and you sit on the wooden block to get the haircut. And that's one of my earliest memories.
Did you actually do any research on barber chairs? Like, what was it? Why did barber chairs look the way they are? Like, are they from the US or?
Actually, the ones you get in Singapore are mostly Japanese.
Oh,
Yeah, the Takara ones, and I guess it was, yeah. I mean, if you look at those old barber chairs, they're made of big
heavy.
cast iron things. They're heavy. They'll last. They'll be around long after I'm gone. So they were designed completely over-engineered, and it's part of why I love them. They're totally over-engineered. And they were made to cut hair. It's amazing, right? Nobody would waste this much engineering on a barber chair nowadays.
Yeah, I
If you
wonder
look at them,
wh-
they're much more simple now.
I wonder why the emphasis on such design and engineering on barber chair.
I think if you went to a male barber in those days, it was much more than just a haircut. It was grooming. They shaved for you. They did all this wet shaves and things like that. People spend a lot more time sitting in those barber chairs than they do now. Now, unless you're going to a professional sort of men's grooming salon, nobody kind of does your, wet shave and things like that anymore. So it's much more transactional nowadays. You go to a barber and cuts your hair and it's like $30 or whatever it is.
Because the barber chair will be the most design engineering thing in the whole barber shop.
Yes, by far.
By far, right?
And they were amazing. If you look at the barber chairs, still now if you buy one, it's almost always in perfect condition. Or you can make it again into perfect condition with a few screws of a screwdriver, So they were just made to really last.
Wow,
Those things will be around long after I'm gone. And as it is, they're already 70, 80 years old when I buy them.
Oh.
So I love collecting them for that reason.
No, I love looking at them too, and was just wondering what was the thought process of this designer and the era this chair was born in.
Yeah, why they made them that. But all the early barber chairs were like that.
Yeah,
If you look at the Kokens and all that, they were all really over-engineered.
yeah, that was the question. If I were to find an answer, I'll come to you. So last question before I jump into a round of quick question. What motivates you to continue to run the business?
At this point, the motivations are simple for me. It's just really about continuing the businesses that I built because they are so much a fabric of my life now. I can't imagine doing anything else. It's really just wanting to continue doing this because it's so much fun, and it's just been such a large part of my identity and my life.
Will you say continuing is it by building more?
Both. Building more and running the ones that I've already built. Because you can't just build them and then ignore them, I guess. And in some ways, the bigger challenge is to continue the businesses of the ones that you have already run open rather than opening new ones.
Yeah. Okay, so round of quick questions. What have you bought recently under $100 that have impacted you the most?
I think for me, father and son T-shirt, because it's kind of fun to kind of have the same T-shirt as your 5-year-old son.
What does it say?
Well, actually, it's the one from National Gallery. It doesn't say anything, but it's got a big block print, and it's more of a modern art kind of impressionist thing, and it's kind of cute, I guess. It's a little bit cheesy, but I like having the same T-shirt as my son sometimes. When the occasion calls for it, it can be quite cute.
Yes. Any books or documentary that you like to recommend?
Well, I haven't read a book in a long time, as I've readily admitted. I feel bad about it. I used to be really.
From your past, any books?
From the past. Well, I've had favorite authors like like Nadine Gordimer and all these. But
How do you spell?
Huh?
How do you spell?
Nadine Gordi. She's a South African.
Fiction?
She's mostly fiction.
Oh.
So Ian McEwan and all these. I have a lot of favorite authors, I guess. But to be honest, I haven't read a book in a long time, and that's partly inertia. Once you stop reading for a while, picking up a book again and getting through the first chapter, sometimes it's a little bit hard, and you get lazy, and there's always something that you want to do, and you forget to, or you just kind of lose track of trying to. So I continue to buy books, but I haven't read one for a long time. But I'll go to the airport, go to the bookstore and pick out a book saying, oh, this sounds amazing, I got to read it. And then it sits on a shelf, I'm ashamed to say. And I haven't picked them up often for a long time,
Any advice for now you're 44, so maybe 18-year-old and 20-year-old self, and place us where you are at?
Wow, 18. I would just have been finishing school in Ireland and coming back to Singapore, do national service. I would have been nervous as hell because I hadn't lived in Singapore for a long time. A little unsure about myself, I guess, because I at that point in time you don't know how you're going to adapt coming back to Singapore and whether you'll enjoy it. So I'd like to reassure myself that actually it's not so bad. You really will enjoy it, and things aren't dramatically different wherever you are in the world. I think Singapore isn't really that different from Ireland after all, despite it being the other side of the world and people having different accents and things like that. Human beings are all ultimately we're all the same. So maybe a little assurance for myself. And what was the other age?
28.
28. Wow, 28 would have been peak of my legal career when I was well, not peak of my legal career, but when I was starting out as a young lawyer. Yeah, I guess for me at that time it was a strange situation because I would say I was doing quite well in the career, but at the same time not finding it very fulfilling. Simply because the work itself wasn't enjoyable at that time. A lot of it was bankruptcy stuff, and bankruptcy is a very miserable area of the law because you are really kind of, you get a front row seat into the misery that business failures can cause. So I wasn't really enjoying it. But I would say to myself at 28, that maybe there's a different thing to life than just work and law practice, because at that point in time you're not enjoying your career. It can seem very demoralizing, right? What do you do? That's the only thing you train for, and you spent years training to be a lawyer. And so the opportunity cost at that time seems very high if you're going to switch, but actually it wasn't very high at all. The opportunity cost was very low. So
maybe that would be what you would tell.
Just a bit of perspective, what you think of.
How were you convinced that little 28 self that?
I think it's just perspective. At that time, it seems like a big thing to switch from law to something else when you've spent the best part of 5-6 years training to be that person. It's not a big deal, I guess.
And it's achievable.
But, it's achievable. Plus, all the things that you've learned is not wasted, because that's what you hear all the time, right? People say, it's wasted your degree, you've wasted all the years you've spent studying. None of it is wasted. It just adds to the, that column of life experience.
When you think of the word successful, who came into your mind and why?
Wow, who came into my mind? I don't know. I think someone like Mother Teresa was successful, simply because she made it her life mission to help others, and she became known for it. It wasn't a conventional career success or being rich or something, And for me, some element of success is always tied up with financial success, I guess, in business. But I think I would like to think at the end of the day, when I'm on my deathbed, that I'll think more about the other things I did in life that gave me as much fulfillment, I guess, whether it's family life, which is something I'm really enjoying at the moment, much more than work in a way. So I'd like to think of myself if succeeding when I'm on my deathbed at 85 or whatever it is, that I've kind of left behind a happy family and, successful in a career sense, my children. But more importantly, that they're happy, I guess.
Are there any routines or habits that you find important?
No, not really. I'm not much of a routine person. I like to just go home after work and hang out with the family. If that's anything like a routine, I guess that's something I enjoy.
Morning routines?
Morning routines, I don't really have any. I'm quite happy to roll with the punches. I don't really have any particular routine. I'm not much of a person who seeks routine either. Generally, I'm quite happy to do different things.
What are some of the most common misconceptions about you or your work?
I think people are always a little bit surprised when they first meet me because they expect me to be much more trendy or fashion forward or something, you know. I always find a tinge of disappointment when they first meet me. Like, wow, okay, you're quite an ordinary person. Yeah, and that's yeah, maybe that's something that people always are surprised by. You know, because I'm perceived to be some style maven or something, lots of fashionable restaurants and hotels, that somehow I must personally myself be a particularly stylish person, which I'm not, you know. So people are always a little bit surprised when they first meet me. Yeah.
If you have a time machine, when and where would you travel to, and what would you do there?
Oh, I think I would travel back to
It could be the future too.
huh?
Either way.
Yeah. I think I would travel back in time though. I think I would go back to the 80s and see what I was doing. I think that would be quite nice. As I said, you know, I very much enjoyed my time in school. I would like to revisit that kind of. I would, you know, and maybe appreciate it more, because you never quite appreciate things until they're over, really, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind me probing a bit further on the school part, like, because I never heard about the overseas boarding school experience. How was it like there?
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I think I really was miserable when I first went. My first year there, I missed home a lot. After that, I had a lot of fun just with.
What were the fun
friends.
things you would like?
I think it was more just the friendships you make. You know, the friendships that last for life. You know, all the friends I made then, I'm still friends with. You go to each other's weddings. Now it's children's christenings and things. Yeah, it's just an amazing part of my life that I would never have got the opportunity without having gone overseas at a young age, I guess. And at the time, I think I didn't appreciate it as much. But over the years, you look back and those were great times, I guess. And I know not everyone enjoys the experience in boarding school. I happen to enjoy it a lot. So perhaps for me,
Do you guys get to go out?
No.
In the week? No, not at all.
No.
So what on the weekend?
You had an exit once a week if you had a guardian outside. And I did have a guardian, but she didn't bring me out that much.
Oh,
so mostly we were confined to the school.
So what were the fun? There was no computer.
No, there was
no
computer.
internet.
No, not
so
in
what
Ireland.
were the fun?
Not in Ireland in 1980s. No, 1985 in Ireland there were no computers.
Hang out in the forest or
Yeah, we would
picking berries.
Yeah,
maybe?
we would literally go picking berries in that. You know, in autumn you pick all the blueberries and your hands would be all stained black. Yeah, I remember, and your whole cheeks would be all black from eating the blackberries and the blueberries, things like that. Yeah, and we would play in the fields. We tried to catch the sheep and things like that.
Oh.
I was in a very rural school.
Oh.
So we were surrounded by sheep and cows and stuff. So it was a fairly bucolic sort of experience, I would guess. You know, yeah, it was fun. I think we did all sorts of naughty things still, you know. Trying to go back of sheds to smoke and things was perceived to be a very grown-up thing to do. You know.
You gotta do it all when you're young. Are there any says or do you like to tell the audience? Things you'd like them to do?
Say or do? I don't know, you know. People always ask me to say something along those lines, and I always struggle. I don't know whether I would have done something if someone had announced it to me, oh, you should do this, you know. I think a lot of times in life you got to find your own mojo, your own kind of thing that gets you going. You know, advice from someone like me is probably not that helpful, because my life experiences and the things that get me going are quite different from what someone else might you know, find. So I don't know. For me, it's really, as trite as it sounds, really about finding the thing that gets your energy and your juices going in the morning. And it's not always easy to find it. I didn't really find it till my 30s. And some people never quite find it, right? They don't enjoy the jobs when they hit their 50s, and that's pretty miserable.
They say
but I've been lucky, I think. You know, I recognize that. I've been extraordinarily lucky.
They say it's a two-part equation, you know. First part is finding out, and that's the toughest part, and the next part is doing it and becoming good at what you do.
And you know, I never discount the fact that, you know, luck plays a big part in what happens to you in life and things like that. As much as people say you make your own luck and things like that, honestly, the chips have to fall at the right time, in the right places, in the right sequence, and sometimes they just fall better for other people than for others. You know, it's not necessarily so because someone is more skillful or they are somehow better at doing something. Often the difference between success and failure is luck, you know, being there at the right time, though, you know, meeting the right person. Could be anything.
Where can people find you or in the interwebs or your projects?
I don't know. I guess unlistedcollection.com.
Yeah, they have Instagram, Facebook.
Instagram and Facebook. Yeah, I'm on Instagram somewhere. Yeah.
Okay, we're done.
Cool. Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. All right. Was you tired?
No, not really. Starting to need to get a drink.
Yeah, well, that's why we prepared.